by David Roberts, written by Alan MacDonald. Dirty Bertie. Today we are reading Fangs, accompanied by Stripes books. Contents. We have Fangs, Hairy and Fashion. We chose Fangs. Chapter 1. It was book week at Bertie's school and everyone had come dressed as their favourite character. Bertie looked round the playground. There were 4 witches, a sprinkling of fairies and a rash of Harry Potters. Darren was dressed as Dennis the Menace and Eugene was dressed as Willy Wonka. Bertie smiled to himself. His costume was better than any of them. He was Count Dracula. He had a black cloak and a pair of plastic fangs. A rubber bat dangled from his wrist like a yo-yo. "Who are you?" asked Eugene, pretending to be Willy Wonka. Bertie glared. Who do you think?" "Dunno, the big bad wolf." "I am Count Dracula!" "Ha ha 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 ha!" said Bertie. "Dracula doesn't wear trainers," said Darren, boasting. Suddenly a dark shadow fell over them. "Good morning," said a sinister voice. Bertie turned around. He gasped. Yikes, it was another vampire, and this one was taller and 10 times as scary. Hey, did I frighten you?" laughed the vampire, taking out his fangs. "Mr. Grouch," said Bertie. "Count Grouch," corrected the caretaker. "I see you had the same idea. Spooky, eh? Spooky, eh?" He looked down at something by Bertie's foot. "What's that?" A sweet wrapper by any chance?" said Bertie. "Litter! Pick it up!" "But I didn't pick it up!" snapped Mr. Grouch. "And don't ever drop litter in my playground. I have my eye on you, you know." He put in his fangs and swept away. "Always watching, always watching." "Yikes!" shivered Eugene. "He scared me to death." "Me too as well," said Darren. How does he sneak up on us like that?" "I don't know," Bertie scowled. "But it's not fair. Dracula was my idea." "Yeah, but his costume was 10 times better, like you said." "Darren, I thought he was a vampire." "Maybe he is," said Eugene to Darren and Bertie. Darren and Bertie stared at him exactly at the same time. "Well," said Eugene, yesterday I passed his shed. You know, the one he always keeps locked." Mr. Grouch was sitting outside, having a drink. Darren shrugged. "So, what's relative to that? And also, why are you telling us that if it's useless?" "It's what he was drinking," said Eugene. "It looked like red, steaming blood." "Blood?" gasped Bertie. "Shh, not so loud," hissed Eugene. "And look at his costume. It fits perfectly. Maybe he really is a vampire." "But vampires can't stand the daylight," objected Darren. "Maybe he's a kind of half vampire," suggested Bertie. "Half vampire, half caretaker." It made sense. Bertie had always thought there was something creepy about a school caretaker. He had staring eyes for a start, and no hair. He hated children, Bertie obviously especially. Plus, he had a weird habit of suddenly appearing like a ghost. "We've got to stop him," said Bertie. "He hasn't done anything yet," said Darren, "except clean the toilets." "How do you know?" said Bertie. "He's not a slave." "How do you know he's not murdering teachers and drinking his blood? What about Miss Withers?" Miss Withers had taught class 2. You know, a class until she had gone home sick and never returned. Or that was what people said. But if Mr. Grouch had murdered her and hidden the body secretly, it was a worrying thought. Eugene fingered his neck uneasily. "Gulp." "What shall we do?" he asked. "Spy on him," said Bertie. "Find out what he's up to. We'll take it in turns." "Good idea," said Darren. "You go first." "Me? Why did it have to be me? I swear it's always me," said Bertie. "Rock, paper, scissors, shoot." Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. But even then Bertie lost. "It's your idea, and anyway, he hates you already." Darren smuggled himself out of that shed. All that morning, Bertie kept an eye on Mr. Grouch through the window. He wrote down everything in his scruffy maths book. Vampire report. 9:15 a.m. Testing. Grouch sweeping up litter. No vampire sightings, but at 10:35 a.m. here's a cup of tea and chocolate biscuit. Dark chocolate. 11:15 a.m. Hasn't bit anyone yet. 11:30 goes into shed. 11:32 a.m. comes out with a mop and a bucket. After lunch, Bertie hung around the shed, hoping to spy on the caretaker. It wasn't long before Mr. Grouch appeared, wearing his usual scowl. He was still dressed in his black vampire's cape. Bertie ducked behind the shed, out of sight. He heard Mr. Grouch unlock the door and go inside. A minute later, the caretaker returned with a bag and a folding chair. He sat down in the sunshine and began to eat sandwiches. Who eats sandwiches that look like that? Thought Bertie. Anyway, it would have been normal if he was so old school in an old school world. Bertie crept to the corner of the shed and peeked out even more. Mr. Grouch was reaching into his bag. Bertie frowned at the sight before his eyes. He brought out an old green thermos and out poured something red, bright and steaming slightly. There was no regretting it. It was blood. Eugene was right. There was no escaping the horrible truth. Mr. Grouch was a vampire. Bertie found Darren and Eugene waiting for him in the playground. Blood, said Darren. When he'd given the report, "You're sure?" "Of course I'm sure. I saw him drink it," said Bertie. "So whose blood was it?" "How do I know? It could have been his for all we know." "I told you he's a vampire," said Eugene. "We should go tell Miss Skinner." "Oh, yeah, she's really going to believe us," said Darren sarcastically. Bertie shook his head. "No. First, we need evidence. We've got to actually prove he's a vampire. But how? He hasn't eaten any of our blood, or better yet, drinking it." "Nor mine," said Darren. "Nor mine," said Bertie. Everybody frowned, thinking hard. Where would Mr. Grouch hide anything he wanted to keep? "The shed," they sang. The shed. I bet there's all kinds of stuff in there, like dead bodies or zombies. Oh, or ghosts and skulls." Eugene turned pale. "But we're not allowed in there. And anyway, he keeps it locked." Bertie had forgotten that Mr. Grouch kept the keys in his pocket and never let them out of sight. Never, ever in his life. And never would he even try to let them out of sight. "Yes, we'll just borrow them," said Bertie, "and break into the shed. Don't worry, it's a kind of like borrowy, steely thing the kids are doing in the school today." Mr. Grouch was working in the boys' toilets. Everybody knew that Bertie was lying because no one actually did the steely, borrowy theme day. Anyway, Mr. Grouch was working and a notice on the door said, "Closed for repairs." Bertie, Darren and Eugene stood inside whispering. "You keep him talking while I look for the keys," said Bertie, shaping his eyebrows up and down. Eugene trembled. "What if he catches us?" Eugene turned pale. "Yeah, what if he tries to bite us?" said Darren after him. "He won't," said Bertie. "Not while the teachers are about. If a single one sees them, he will catch the vampire with the cops. Easy." It was now or never. Bertie pushed open the door and the three of them crept in. Mr. Grouch was up a ladder fixing a light. "Oh, sorry," said Bertie. "We just needed a toilet." "Can't you read?" snapped Mr. Grouch. "You'll have to wait." "Okay," gulped Eugene. "Actually, I'm bursting," said Bertie. "And Darren needs a poo, and—" "I said, come back later," roared Mr. Grouch. They backed away towards the door. Bertie was half scared, but he stopped and Mr. Grouch's box lay on the floor and on top was a set of silver keys. Bertie pretended and tumbled over it. What were you going? Groaned Mr. Grouch. Sorry. Bertie bent over and put away the tools that he's built. A minute later, he joined the other two outside. A fat lot of good that was, said Darren. Oh, I don't know. Bertie smiled. He held up his hands, dangling a large bunch of keys. Mr. Grouch's shed stood by itself in the corner of the playground. It was strictly out of bounds. Bertie fiddled with the keys, trying to find the right one. Hurry up, moaned Eugene. What if someone comes? Someone, anyone. It has to be the stupid caretaker. I'm being as quick as I can, you know, said Bertie. At last, Bertie tried a small silver key. It turned with a click and the padlock sprang open. Of course it had to be the smallest key, he said. It's a vampire, obviously. He pulled back the door and they stepped inside. What a dump, said Bertie. The shed was piled high with boxes and buckets and tins, and a jumble of old paint pots littered the floor. On the walls hung Mr. Grouch's collection of brooms, rakes and mops. Darren looked around. There's nothing here, except for junk and stuff that only teachers like. Wait, there must be something, said Bertie convincingly. We've got to find evidence, he persuaded. Eugene kept a lookout for the door. While the other two were standing there, Bertie found Mr. Grouch's dirty overalls hanging on her hook. Next to them was a big bag. Inside was some newspaper, some gardening gloves, a lunchbox, and, Mr. Grouch's old green thermos. Look at this, said Bertie excitedly. Open it, said Darren. Eugene turned pale. Bertie unscrewed the lid. The thermos was empty. Eugene kept on saying, Quick, quick, go, go! But they didn't listen to him. It was bright red stains that smeared the walls of the green thermos. He sniffed it. It smelled oddly familiar. Well, asked Darren. Blood, nodded Bertie. There's our proof. Eugene yelped. A tall figure in a cloak was marching across the playground towards them. It's Mr. Grouch! I told you! Run! Darren and Eugene bolted out of the door. In panic, Bertie looked around. He stuffed the things back into Mr. Grouch's bag, keeping the thermos as evidence, obviously. But just as he rushed through the door, a dark figure blocked his path. Mr. Grouch's eyes blazed like literal fire. What do you think you're doing? He growled. Did you take my keys? No, stammered Bertie. Liar, hand them over. Liar, liar, pants on fire. It's no good, said Bertie. We know, we've got proof. Proof that you're a vampire, obviously, said Bertie. Don't be an idiot, said Mr. Grouch. Give me no keys. I won't ask you again. He took a step closer. Bertie could see his mad, staring eyes and deadly fangs. He knew it would happen. This is it, he thought. I'm going to be murdered, fanged to death. I have to escape. There was no escaping the horrible truth. Yeah! He rushed at the vampire, knocking him off his balance. Mr. Grouch stepped back into a paint pot and fell over. Bertie burst out of the shed door and slammed it shut. Click, click, click. He snapped the pad door, closed and ran for his life. Hey, yelled Mr. Grouch, let me out. Chapter 4. Back in classroom, Bertie stared out of the window. Miss Boot, or Winnie the Witch as she was today, was droning on about homework. Across the playground, noises came from the shed. Thump, thump, bang. Mr. Grouch had been locked in the shed for an hour and he heard sounds across. Luckily, Miss Boot paid no attention. She seemed to think the caretaker was mending a fence. Someone poked Bertie on the back. What if he gets out? Hissed Eugene. He can't. But what if he does? He saw you, Bertie. Thump. Was it Bertie's imagination or were the noises getting louder? Thump, bump, bang, clunk. Mr. Grouch was trying to break the door down. Maybe vampires had the strength of 10 men? Bertie! boomed Mrs. Boot. "Stop staring out of the window. Get on with your work." Bertie tried to concentrate, but it was no use. He looked at what he scribbled in his science book. "The earth goes round the sun. The sun is big and red, like blood." He glanced back out of the window. "Rah!" The shed door was open, hanging off its hinges. All the blood was smeared around the house. Grouch had escaped. Bertie's heart beat faster and faster. He glanced round. "Don't panic," he thought. "Miss Boots here, and even vampires are afraid of her. Any case, she's fat. He won't come into class and... Ah! Wham! The door burst open. Mr. Grouch stood there, red-faced and furious. "Ah!" everyone shouted. His cape was torn and trousers were splashed with paint. "Mr. Grouch!" cried Miss Boot. "What on earth?" The caretaker stormed into the room. "Where's that boy?" he panted. "Just let me get my hands on him." Bertie was trying to slide down under his desk. But Mr. Grouch spotted him. "You," he yelled. "I want a word with you." Miss Boot barred his way. "Mr. Grouch, you are interrupting my class. What is this about?" "Ask him," said Mr. Grouch, pointing at Bertie. "He stole my keys. He locked me in the shed." Miss Burt glared at Bertie. "Bertie, is that true?" "I had to," said Bertie. "He's a vampire. He's murdering people." Mr. Grouch rolled his eyes. "It's a costume, you dope, for World Book Week." "Don't listen to him," said Bertie desperately. "He drinks blood. We've seen him." "Blood?" said Mr. Grouch. "What are you talking about?" "This," said Bertie. He reached under his desk and brought out the green thermos. He tipped it up and showed everyone the inside. "See? Red. Those are blood stains." Mr. Grouch snorted. "That's tomato soup." What?" gulped Bertie. "Soup? Tomato soup? I have it for my... not blood?" Bertie sniffed at it. He knew the smell was familiar. Oops, if it wasn't blood, then Mr. Grouch wasn't really a vampire. He was just hopping mad caretaker who Bertie had locked in the shed for over an hour. Bertie backed away. There was only one thing for it. "Bertie!" yelled Miss Boot. "Come back here!"